It's over, we're done, everything's doomed. At this point, the world is pretty much getting worse all the time, and nothing's ever gonna be good ever again because there's no justice in the world and no good deed goes unpunished. I thought Hitman 2016 was a good game, but it has failed to meet Square Enix's sales expectations, resulting in them deciding to sell off the development studio, which has in turn resulted in a round of layoffs to make them a cheaper purchase after they've already laid off employees who were working on Kane and Lynch after that whole franchise failed to catch on when 2 installments didn't pick up the slack over an earlier Hitman Absolution, which also failed to pick up the slack. And wouldn't you know it, evidently Hitman Absolution sold better than Hitman 2016. I mean, what the hell kind of planet do we live on? Actually, the world's not all that bad. Square Enix is taking an active role in making sure IO Interactive finds a new buyer, and they're now clarifying that they're selling the Hitman IP along with the developer, so they're not just going to sit on the property and let Season 2 go to waste. Basically, business is supposed to go on as usual, there's just going to be someone else writing IO's paychecks for the same kind of work. A sequel to Season 1 is still in development, and Season 1 is still being updated and expanded, but those layoffs are going to mean that getting Season 2 smoothly pushed out the door is going to be more challenging than anticipated, and none of those silver linings still explain how the hell things got this bad in the first place. Maybe how the hell things got this bad in the first place is because we live in a world where a game's sales are oftentimes determined more by their marketing budget rather than their quality. And for that matter, the challenge of marketing Hitman 2016 is a problem that encompasses almost every other challenge the game had going against it. As the 6 episodes were coming out over the year, which particular one deserved the biggest advertising push? Do you market episode 1 when the hype cycle is naturally at its peak and the honeymoon effect of the game's original launch has begun? Or do you wait, long after reviews have taken hold and the dust has settled, to market the complete experience 7 months later? How do you market and appropriately design a hardcore, repetitive, and demanding stealth game to a mainstream audience? For that matter, should you? Thinking back on 2016, I don't remember the marketing push for each singular episode being that grand of an effort. Save for this TV commercial airing towards the end of the season that cut through a lot of bombastic footage of guns and soldiers. But the middling sales of Watch Dogs 2 illustrates another one of Hitman's problems, which is that a well-reviewed sequel to a disappointing but highly sold predecessor has an extra hurdle to jump over, which is that a massive amount of customers now have low expectations out of the brand. Add to that Hitman's experimental structure. AAA episodic gaming still hasn't really caught on, and episodic gaming in general doesn't have a positive history unless your name is Telltale. But despite these setbacks, Square Enix is infamous for setting ridiculously high sales goal expectations for its Western franchises, which is another oddball quirk of this oddball partnership between Japanese and Western companies whose conflicting corporate cultures culminate to what I can only imagine are basically a lot of frustrating conference calls. For example, the very announcement of Square's intention to sell IO and Hitman in the first place, which puts alarming and ambiguous news like that out while the plans are still up in the air and a definitive buyer hasn't been found yet, is speculated by Eurogamer as being the result of them wanting to inform shareholders before the end of the financial year, which I thought happened months ago, but as it turns out, the Japanese financial year is different. Square's project management of their Western franchises is, not exactly super ideal. These characters don't exactly fit their historical lineup. They seem to grossly overinflate their expected sales figures, and in the case of Deus Ex, they attempted something a little similar to what Hitman ended up doing, splitting a new installment up into multiple sequels and releases where previously there were none. As it stands, the latest Deus Ex's uncharacteristically limited scenery, tacked on breach minigame, and disappointing endings has led to it also underperforming. And as it stands, Hitman's marketing hype cycle had to be thinly spread across an entire year rather than the usual 2 to 3 weeks. I'm not just speculating by saying Square Enix was splitting these projects up into more products that weren't originally part of the plan. Jim Sterling reported, admittedly from uncorroborated anonymous sources, on rumors that Mankind Divided was split into 2 games early on with the sequel being developed at the same time, up until the devs found out they couldn't work on 2 big projects at once and still meet Square Enix's deadline. For this video, I also tried to get in touch with developers, but sure enough was only met with silence. But Dimitri Halle, at a German news website called GameStar.de, was able to confirm rumors that turned out to be an official announcement a couple weeks later. After hooking up with him, he was eager to remind me of something I had completely forgotten about. That Hitman 2016 was originally planned to launch in just 2 episodes rather than 6. Between IO and SE, which company do you think is more responsible for splitting this up into so many episodes?
I think Square Enix, they're a publisher. They are pushing their release date, their release schedule, and I think IO just wasn't quick enough. They would have needed more time to finish the game, but they were not getting more time, which is understandable from a publishing point of view. But I think the decision was made because they needed to ship the game and just wanted to sell their first episode, so they had to split it up into 7 episodes, which eventually hurt the game, in my opinion.
You can still look up their old press releases and news reports detailing how they planned for this to go. One $35 pack would include the tutorials, Paris, Sapienza, and Marrakesh levels, while a $30 upgrade pack would include the rest. And when you look at the pacing and structure of the full experience that was finally put together a year and a half later, you can see how that makes a lot more sense than what we got. The bigger, more crowded, more technically impressive levels came first, but not too first. I think Sapienza is the best level in the franchise. It's the real hook moment of Hitman 2016. It's where 2 or 3 hours into the game, one's final opinion would begin to take shape. And afterwards, an invested player would surely want to see what's next after such a high peak. But as it stands, Sapienza released behind 2 paywalls, a $15 first episode and then a $10 Sapienza episode. While journalists had played preview builds of Sapienza before launch, the core fans, who were arguably the people who would be setting the first public impressions of Hitman, paid up for a game without that really impressive hook level that finally takes off the training wheels and ramps up the size and scope and possibilities of what the players learned in the previous levels. Add to that the ambiguity of this bonus episode. This also threw a lot of people off. When I was playing through my press code of the full experience, I got to enjoy 2 really cool remixed levels that a friend of mine, someone who was an actual die-hard core fan of the series who was buying the episodes one at a time as they came out for $10 each, had completely missed. The nighttime version of Marrakesh is great. I had more fun with it than the regular version of Marrakesh, but hiding it away into this extra $10 bonus episode meant more players missed out on more great moments. Do you think Hitman got as big of a marketing push as it deserved?
I think the marketing push was too small in the wrong moments. I think they should have waited for the first 2 or 3 episodes to get finished by the developers and then put them all together into one big package with Sapienza and Morocco. And they should have put that out and then put all their marketing budget on that.
Though our price per level is still pretty much in line with their original plan, the timing, pacing, and exposure of those launches turned out way different from their intention, which probably contributes to a lot of the straight-up vitriol you see among some fans towards this game. No matter how good it turned out, there's a crowd who just won't ever buy into the idea of episodic gaming. It's just straight-up sacrilege to a lot of fans. The idea of splitting Hitman into 2 was already a risk, so split those 2 up into 6, 7 episodes, now a lot of fans are 3 times more mad at them, I guess. In a few reasons or more, why do you think Hitman failed to meet Square Enix's expectations?
I think there are several reasons for that, but the first reason is lies in Hitman's DNA as a stealth game. If you look at any stealth game in the last couple of years, they all failed. I mean, you have Splinter Cell Blacklist, which failed quite miserably. You can name Deus Ex or Thief or Dishonored 2. They all failed. Except for Metal Gear Solid 5, and that was a modern military open world game, so that doesn't count. So I think stealth is not that big anymore. Yeah, I mean, Hitman has always been a fan game, or a game for a very specific community. It's, in French they say, a connoisseur game, so a game for enthusiasts who can enjoy this kind of gameplay. It was always a niche game, and I think IO Interactive just wanted something bigger. If you look at Hitman Absolution, that was the first experiment to promote this game for a very large audience. And with Hitman, IO made the decision to make it more like the old games, like Blood Money and Silent Assassin, which from a player's point of view was the right decision, but from a marketing sales point of view might have been the wrong decision.
This is just food for thought. I don't know if I entirely agree, basically because MGS5, which despite having a hell of a lot of criticism, controversy, and negativity aimed at it, managed to be the best-selling Metal Gear game out of the whole franchise. It's a Japanese weird stealth action game with almost 30 years of backstory baggage behind it, and it still broke 6 million copies. Those numbers are a real anomaly given the circumstances, but don't point towards the conclusion of stealth games being a bad investment. Especially after even Square Enix themselves claimed that 2011's Deus Ex did perfectly okay. And even the existence of unsuccessful Hitman, Thief, and Splinter Cell sequels point to a healthier genre market than the doldrums we had between 2006 and 2010, where, outside of MGS4, I think, there basically weren't any dedicated AAA stealth action games being released at all. The rise of digital stores, the Call of Duty bubble popping, and the adoption of much more easier dev tools have encouraged developers to at least be a little more risky than they were 10 years ago. And all the while, despite some creative bankruptcy, the gaming industry still manages to keep growing and continues to break records. And as a result, I genuinely think that today's market is pretty nice. It's one where a lot of genres and styles of AAA games that were seemingly on hiatus during the mid to late 2000s are suddenly getting some love again. But naturally, not everything can be successful in a competitive marketplace. This is normal. FPS games, MOBA games, sports games will still dominate sales charts, and stealth games will still have an uphill climb to make. MGS5 still managed to scale that climb, and Deus Ex Human Revolution managed to scale that climb, so I don't think Hitman 2016 failing mostly had to do with it being a stealth game, because it was a good stealth game. It was a stealth game good enough to make that climb. I think there's just a lot of other factors contributing more here. Factors that really shouldn't have anything to do with the core gameplay, but ended up hampering it anyway. Although I waited a year for the season to complete, thus not having to deal with the annoying wait between episodes, I still had to deal with its bewildering and unconvincing excuse to keep the game plugged into the internet. Alongside other successful control counterexamples like once again MGS5, but also Arkham Knight, Battlefield 1, and Mad Max, Hitman installs itself alongside the much maligned Denuvo DRM software. But unlike those examples, Hitman sticks out by very explicitly requiring a connection to the internet. During launch, when servers were at their most unstable, you couldn't level up your level 1 Hitman for players who had to play it offline. And as time progresses, those offline players are eventually gonna be everyone. Servers don't last forever. Even the Space Jam website's gotta go away eventually.
I've made a huge mistake.
So I'm not exactly surprised that this is a feature that IO is slowly backpedaling on. According to their own excuse, Hitman is a live experience because of a lineup of single-player missions that are supposedly meant to be constantly added and removed from the game per update by design. A lot of this game's content is supposed to be going away forever here, and what also concerns me is how developers themselves, who spend years of their lives making this stuff, don't seem to fight harder for it to be kept around for the memories later. This problem, that the game is decaying away with time, was a huge black mark against it in my otherwise positive review, as was the case for a lot of other reviews reluctant to enjoy the game. Because there's a laundry list of reasons as to why its innovations are probably not healthy for customers in the long term, many of which aren't necessarily DRM in the traditional sense, but instead a content release scheme that ends up fulfilling much of the same purpose. This is a game being sold as a service, but it's a single-player action game. Its genre and style isn't really a good fit for the same model that works for Telltale and Overwatch. And despite IO's attempt, it may never be. One of the more frightening and conflicting thoughts I had while playing was that Hitman 2016 might actually be the first single-player, always-online game good enough to get away with it. But I guess the silver lining to this situation is that it wasn't, after all. Maybe that means there is some kind of justice to this situation. It might not just have made much sense during the heat of the moment. Hindsight is 2020, and the reasons Hitman failed may make a little more sense as more of the products and its publishers' shortcomings come to mind. Square and Enix have been lucky enough to be making mass-marketable, all-ages, iconic console video game mascots since the 80s, and for some reason they expect their much smaller Europadian acquisitions, who make these cerebral, PC-centric, M-rated violence games, to hit similar high numbers. They pushed for a deadline that IO couldn't meet, and instead of delaying, IO ended up compromising on splitting their 2-part game up into 6 parts. 7 if you include this mystery bonus episode that has 2 damn good remix levels that more players should know about. On that note, the complete 6-episode package was undermarketed and spread thin enough over the year to pass right over the heads of a lot of potential customers who would have liked this game if they had known about it. And the hardcore word-of-mouth marketing that could have filled that gap was likely hampered by IO themselves trying to maximize profits with this games-as-service scheme that is inconvenient, if not outright hostile, to end consumers. So they've ended up with a great game that perfectly represents one of the worst problems about gaming in the past decade. Since the advent of the Day 1 patch, it's usually the most dedicated hardcore fans who care the most about a franchise and spend the most money on it as it comes out who are definitely getting the worst deal. This situation just ramps that problem up a notch. Be patient, be thrifty, wait a year for prices to go down and patches to polish things up, and maybe then you can enjoy Hitman the way it was meant to be played. Too bad that's not super profitable for these developers in the short term.